quick response from you, Manish Tewari, to what you heard, that according to Jai Panda, at 7%, and as I said, compared to the rest of the world, India has done a reasonable job in controlling inflation.
Well, Rajdeep, Jay has tried to put a very interesting spin onto it, but the fact remains that when the UPA was in government, if you had high inflation, you also had high growth. So therefore, if you look at UPA 1, the average year-on-year growth rate was 8.36%. The average year-on-year growth rate for UPA 2 was about 7.68%. So on an average, we did talk about 8% year-on-year growth for 10 long years. But what do you see in this particular case? You are seeing low growth and high inflation. And let me give you the numbers. 2017-18, and this is a year after the infamous demonetization, growth was at 6.8%. It comes down to 6.6% the next year, down to 3.7%, then minus 6.6%, which of course was the COVID-19 year, and then goes up to 8.9%, but that's a statistical history. Because you start from such a low base, you are actually doing 2.3%. So essentially what India is facing today is a double whammy. You have low growth and you have high inflation. And that's the point of departure from the UPA years, which they love to quote. Because in the UPA years, you had high growth, but yes, you had high inflation.
You know, to add to that, and Jay, I will ask you to pick up on the second question. Low growth, high inflation, you're free to respond to that. I know you're nodding, you're shaking your head. But the second big question is on oil prices, because many have believed that this, in a way, has kick-started inflation. Who's to blame, centre or states? During the debate in Parliament, it was suggested by members of the government that the UPA years, the oil bonds issued were partly responsible for high fuel prices. But the fact is, Jai Panda, you've never passed the burden even of low global oil prices onto the consumer. Instead, we are now seeing windfall profits being made by many of the oil companies, but the benefits never pass on to the consumer. So the charge being made is even before the Russia-Ukraine war, oil prices were not in keeping with international global prices, and we paid a heavy cost for it. A, who do you blame for it? And B, if you want to respond to what Manish Tewari said earlier.
Yes, first of all, you said the benefits have not been passed on to the consumer. Now that's completely wrong, because the massive investments India has made in solar energy, which is now third in the world, would not have been possible without those revenues. And that ultimately benefits the Indian consumer, because it keeps energy prices overall, in the basket of energy prices, under control. Now, I must respond to something Manish said. He said something quite odd, that the Ukraine crisis has actually benefited India. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Ukraine crisis has not benefited any country in the world. It has affected oil prices. As I said, India had bounced back from COVID and continues to bounce back with high growth rates. Inflation was reasonable compared to all other countries and remains very reasonable. I will again quote not only Raghuram Rajan, but reports that have recently come out by Bloomberg and by Deloitte, two major financial institutions on the global scene. Now, to talk about low growth rate and high inflation is actually extremely odd, because India has just become the fastest growing large economy in the world, and lower inflation than the US, for instance. By the way, the US has just gone into recession with two successive quarters of negative growth. And in this scenario, for India to be hailed by global financial markets as the leading light in rebooting the global economy is something remarkable. And you know, you can keep going back to the history, but the reality is, when the UPA government started, it had inherited from the earlier NDA government high growth and low inflation, and that sustained with a momentum for a few years and then crashed because of policy paralysis. So that the average is not important. What is important is at the end of the UPA tenure, we had extremely high inflation and extremely low growth rate. And today we have the highest growth rate among large economies in the world, and we have lower inflation than all major economies. That's just a plain fact.
Jai Panda, do you want to respond to oil prices? The fact is that we've steadily seen, even when oil prices were low between 2015 and 17, the benefits were never passed on to consumer. Instead, you made, by some estimates, a whopping amount, 25,000 crores and more, 25 lakh crores and more from your oil revenues. That's the reality.
Rajdeep, I responded to this question earlier. You are keeping on repeating it. Let me respond again. I said the revenues, the resources that accrued from that have been reinvested massively in the energy sector to take India to the third largest installation of solar power in the world. Who do you think that benefits? That benefits the Indian consumer in one way or another. Now, the second thing is, you said windfall profits. You know, India did impose windfall taxes on the oil companies operating in India because of the rise in oil prices, which is purely an international phenomenon. India is subject to international oil prices like almost, very few other countries to this extent of dependence. And to change that is the massive investment that's happening in renewable and other forms of energy, which India can find a sustainable source going forward.